Maestro, good evening.
Evening.
Thank you so much for accepting our invitation from Sinfonia Varsovia Orchestra to conduct us, to be with us and to make music with us because of our 37th anniversary. It's like our birthday concert. And having you, Maestro, here, I'd like to talk about music, about emotions, about the orchestras. And the first question is, how did it all start? I mean, how you became close to the music? It was because of your mom was the violin player or your father was a trumpet player and they asked you to learn music, or how it was?
No, not at all. I'm not a very young man anymore, as you might know. And in my German, I have to say, my German childhood, it was even in a lower bourgeois atmospheric region. It was in those times, meaning immediately after the Second World War, when I was 6 years old, it was a quite normal thing, even if a family, if a mother or grandparents didn't have a real instrumentally linked connection with music, it was quite normal that a younger child should learn either the violin or the piano, just having lived in its childhood an experience of a musical instrument. Nothing more and nothing less. This is, of course, past decades, and unfortunately, it's not anymore the case with our young people, or with even, that is the big problem, the young people of 30 years ago. But in my early years, it was also, I think, in my class in school, that many, not even gifted young people, just were used to learn an instrument. That was my start. Of course, my grandparents liked music, and my mother liked music, but it was not more than this. So I started, I think it was 6 years, it was 7 or something like that. I started with violin with a completely amateur teacher who gave me, nevertheless, an impression of that playing nicely the violin would have been a nice thing to do during other things that you did with school learning, preparing, and some other interesting things for a young child. And he discovered very shortly after I started with him that he would not be, that he didn't want to be responsible for my musical education. Perhaps he discovered a certain, a certain tiny little gift in being interested in playing violin. So he told my mother, I think after a couple of months, again, I think I was 7, or that he would like or prefer to give up teaching me the violin, and that my mother should look for some more professional teacher. And via a very strange connection that would be would have no importance now in our talk to explain. She came into contact with one of the 2 concertmasters of the Wuppertal. I grew up in Wuppertal. I'm born in this city here, but nevertheless, I grew up in Wuppertal, of the Wuppertal City Orchestra, Wuppertaler Städtisches Orchester. And he was, I think in a certain way, he saw a certain musical talent. He was interested in teaching me. He was not a very good pedagogue. He was very, very tough. And he took me on, I think, when I was, say, about 8 years ago. I was 8 years old. And I showed, I wouldn't say an overwhelming interest in music, but I showed a certain interest in playing well the violin. And then my grandparents bought an old piano, a normal piano, and I was sort of interested in getting the notes right, and I taught myself the bass key, for instance. And so I came to, apart from really having to work each day on the violin, I came to play the piano a little bit on my own. And then, of course, my violin teacher said, well, you have to be taught correctly also the piano. And I think, when I was 9 or 10, I don't know, don't remember exactly, had a piano teacher who also very early in my school years taught me, apart from piano playing, what we call in German counterpoint, Harmonielehre und Kontrapunkt. So when it came to, well, during the years when I was 13, 14, 15, I applied as a young guy for some city fundings. We were very poor people. For some money each year, it was, I remember very well, it was each year one had to play in front of a commission of players from the Wuppertal Städtisches Orchester and in front of the Generalmusikdirektor at that time, once a year to get such a stipendium. And I got, from my age of 13 onwards, I got each year 300 Deutschmarks. That was per month 25 Deutschmarks, but it was an important symbolic encouragement to continue working on the violin and on the piano. And with that stipendium, I was obliged to enter, at that time in Wuppertal, existing youth orchestra, who met once a week, an evening, led by one of the other concertmasters of the orchestra. And I was the only guy who was still at school. All the others were already students at the Musikhochschule in Cologne and in Düsseldorf. So when I was 13, I started when I was 13. I was the only young guy, and all the others were about 19, 20, 21, 22, and so on. But that experience each Monday during the years, working very precisely and very professionally on rather difficult string orchestras repertoire, confirmed me in my interest to not to go for a profession in music, but definitely to remain close in my life to music. Might it be violin, might it be piano. I was not at all, before the Abitur, before the end of the school, I was not at all decided to go professionally into the music. But being close to that atmosphere, that was absolutely clear, and that was reinforced by living these experience with the other people in that Wuppertal youth orchestra.
And on that time, it was string orchestra, which means no conductor?
Yes. There were plenty of people. I think it was at least 10 to 12, perhaps even more first violins, and 10 to 12 second violins, and so on. But all these people, all these other people were already determined to go into musical business, to try to enter professional orchestras. And it was conducted by one of the leaders of the Wuppertal Symphony Orchestra, who knew all these pieces very, very well, and you knew what to do and tell the people how to get things right. So it was very interesting.
And do you remember the moment, the day that you decided to switch violin to the conductor stick, or it was just a longer time where you did violin playing and conducting both?
I think on violin, but especially on piano, I was really, I dare say that I was a brilliant sight reader.
Oh.
I could play everything on first sight, and even if there would have been complicated pianistic structures, I knew what was important, and I knew what was less important to leave it out. So, of course, there were, during my last 2 school years, there were discussions, well, my violin teacher wanted me to leave school before Abitur, to go to Cologne, to the Musikhochschule, and to work on the violin, to enter later an orchestra or become a concertmaster or something like that. My mother was violently against it. She said, the guy can do what he wants, but he needs to have the Abitur, which is nowadays, well, it's Matura, or how do you call that here in Poland? Yes. It's nowadays something completely normal for everybody. In the 50s, in Germany, to have the Abitur, to have the Matura, was still something, I wouldn't say extraordinary, but made you immediately belong to an intellectual upper class, which is completely ridiculous, of course, but it was seen like this. I had my Abitur in the year 1958, and my mother said, you can do, after your Abitur, you can do what you want, but I want you absolutely to get this Abitur. I got it. I think I was quite good also in mathematics, and I was at the end of this school period, I was very much thinking about, should I either go in a musical direction, whatever it might have been, or should I try to go into, how do you call that, natural sciences or something like that. But one thing always during my last school years became more and more important for me was it's basically a psychological weakness, but anyway, it became important for me that whatever I would do professionally, that I should be entitled to tell other people what to do, and not other people to tell me what to do. So school finished. I tried to do it both. In Cologne, Wuppertal is about 45 kilometers northeast of Cologne. So I enrolled at the Cologne Musikhochschule and at the same time at the Cologne University for mathematics. And for violin and piano, not immediately conducting. I had to find out things about it. Violin and piano, and of course, Harmonielehre and counterpoint, I knew that already. And the Cologne University, mathematics. And I tried to keep that going for nearly 1 year, for nearly 2 semesters, but I saw it was even concerning time, it was absolutely out of question to continue the 2 things at the same time. During these first months at the Cologne Musikhochschule, you had also, of course, you had to play in the Hochschulorchestra. And there I saw other students, should I say conducting, or should I say trying, making efforts to conduct, and they couldn't. Or they were very weak. And that made my decision. I said, that definitely you can do better than all these people there. And I decided to go into this conducting direction. Nevertheless, I didn't finish. I gave up the mathematics, and I didn't finish the Musikhochschule because basically, what can you learn in a class, in a conducting class? I am profoundly convinced nothing. These gestures you learn in 2 hours or whatsoever, and you get the feeling if these gestures fit your physics well, or you get the feeling it's awkward for you. So I felt quite well. And the teachers told me, well, the really learning, at that time, it's over today. At that time, so end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, you go to a small theater, you are a singer's coach, a korrepetitor, you work the singing roles with the singers, and perhaps if it's a small theater, you get the possibility when a conductor is sick to take over a performance. So I was just lucky. I heard that in Aachen, which is the extreme west of West Germany, close to the Dutch and Belgian border, the Stadttheater was looking for korrepetitor. And I applied and I played, and so they took me. And so my first year at the theater, I think I was, what was I then? 23. I left the Musikhochschule. I have no document of having finished studies or so. I left the Musikhochschule and I got this korrepetitor job in Aachen for 1 year. Then they fired me because there came a new music director who had his own assistant. And so I had to apply in Cologne at the opera. So they took me there and I got plenty of opportunities already in Aachen and then in Cologne, of course, apart from coaching singers, to conduct, to perform. And I got the feeling that I was at ease in conducting opera, at ease in getting together the orchestra in the pit and the scene, the chorus. For instance, the chorus is far away from the front stage or so. It's not so easy to get things together. I felt that I was physically in my gestures at ease in doing this. And that made me confirm the decision going into that professional direction.
And shall we say your first conducting experience was opera?
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely opera.
Definitely.
And at that time, did you have any hero conductor that you were in love or you wanted to be as this famous conductor? Was any name you can mention from that time?
Yeah, at the Cologne Musikhochschule, there was one professor for conducting who was a very experienced, but not, I would say not very inspired opera conductor. And exactly in the second year of this, the chief conductor of the Cologne Opera, not of the concerts in Cologne, but of the Cologne Opera, was the rather youngish Wolfgang Sawallisch, who was already there, quite, what should I say, rising star is not the right word, but he was very well known. And so I switched into his class, and he told me exactly the same what the other teacher told me. Forget about the Hochschule here. It's all nothing. Go to an opera and learn the business there. But he was in these, he was not a very good pedagogue, and he was, his teaching manner, of course, has always been throughout his whole life a brilliant pianist. So he explained everything from playing the piano, and I think at that time at the end of his 30s, beginning 40s, he didn't really think about music. He just did it. But this is then to learn from that approach is not very, what should I say? It's not very helpful. Mm-hmm. But of course, he was, for me, in these years, he was eine Leitfigur, lead, of course. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to become somebody like this in a different way, but like this. So that other, of course, during my Wuppertal years at school, there was the Generalmusikdirektor of the Wuppertal City Orchestra, was an old, very experienced in German repertoire conductor, Hans Weisbach. The name doesn't mean anything anymore. But I got some very, very important impressions from some concerts in Wuppertal. For instance, with Brahms symphonies or Bruckner symphonies, I had no judgment, no means of judging if that performance would have been excellent or just good or not so good or so. But I was very impressed from these listening experiences. But that at that time, that didn't make me think about becoming a conductor later. That came really later. And the most important thing to start thoughts about that decision was, I want to tell other people what they should do, nicely, of course, not like this, nicely, but I always was determined to avoid to find myself in a position when other people have to tell me what I should do.
Yes, and being a conductor, maestro, is like being a leader and being this captain who decides about everything, especially the opera house. Yeah. And what could be your advice for those young people who are thinking, oh, we are complete conductor, complete artists, and they are so wrong? How they should think now, how to prepare to be a great conductor?
Yeah, these things are, I would say, unfortunately, finished. Other people, younger people, would say it's not necessary anymore. I think the only real teacher of conducting is conducting an opera without having a rehearsal, just jumping in and develop, whilst doing this, the sense of the distance in meters to the scene, the sense of not covering a voice when the voice is more important than the orchestra, and all these things. That either you learn in your early years in the opera pit, and I dare say in your 20s, at the foremost into your early 30s, and then more or less, it's my theory, your structuring of your personality is finished. And what comes after, learning it later, trying to learn these reflexes later, I have my doubts about it. And you can see it all over. There are so many very convinced people who have plenty of musical ideas and try to transfer them to the players and all that, and don't have the manual skills in not explaining things and talking to the orchestra about minutes and minutes and minutes, just saying nothing and do it right. And that was my experience, of course, looking back at this time now, 60 years ago. It has transformed in a complete different situation, but also there isn't anymore in Germany this normal repertoire theater, Stadttheater style. That means even a smaller theater has in its repertoire to be performed without a rehearsal at least 5 to 6 to 7 operas. And at those times in the 60s and 70s and even in the 80s of the last century, the big opera houses, Hamburg, Berlin, Munich, a little bit Cologne, a little bit Stuttgart, they had a repertoire available from one day to another of 30 to 35 operas. And an orchestra at that time, without a rehearsal, of course, there had been a new production of an opera, and then the new production was well rehearsed. But this production then, if it was a successful one, remained in the house's repertoire for sometimes 6 to 10 years. And there was never, ever later a recapitulation rehearsal. And the orchestras could do it. They can't do that anymore. We are, because of, well, there are plenty of reasons. There is, of course, much more importance to a top standard of every evening performance, which is absolutely okay. There's secondly the development of the music written after the Second World War. There needs to be, because of the complications of new music, there needs to be an over-precise relationship per view between the musicians and the conductor. But these older repertoires, which of course meant all the Mozart operas, the Weber Freischütz, nearly all the Wagner operas, nearly all the Strauss operas, the Verdis, the Puccinis, the musicians, the experienced musicians in the opera orchestras had those things in their bones. And there was just a little look to the conductor and it worked. It's not the case anymore.
Yes, I was at the rehearsal 2 days ago. Your rehearsal with our orchestra, Sinfonia Varsovia, and I was watching and listening the finale of 4th Brahms Symphony. And I was absolutely amazed by such a symbolic gesture could change sound of the orchestra completely. And I was amazed how you do it with such a simple movements.
I think a conductor shouldn't have to think what he should do with his gestures, and not to think about what he should do with his gestures the next 2 seconds. He just should. Your arm should think. So you shouldn't be by no means concentrated or concerned by your doing. And you start rehearsing, you listen what you hear, you compare it whilst you are continuing conducting. You compare that what you hear with what you would like to hear. And you immediately, the faster the better, have to find out where the difference is and what you should immediately tell the musician A or the musician Y to play louder or softer to get the right mix of the sound. That, of course, is your personal musical decision. It's your idea of the sound that you want to have. And then you have to go into the if the correct phrasing isn't there, you have by your gestures try to sculpture these phrasing things. And that, of course, if I may say so, is the result of an enormous amount of years of experience, a little bit psychological experience also. You watch the players, you look at them, you try, say, speaking the woodwinds or the horns, you try to imagine their personality a little bit by their reflects that they have. And all that together brings then up a certain result that might please me, not forcefully all other people, but then I take my responsibility for it and I have to stand for that. And if the audience likes it, it's this. And if they don't, it's this. But it's me, and it's then not the musician's responsibility.
Yes, an orchestra like 95 or 100 individual artists with their own ideas should go in one direction with the conductor. Orchestra as the instrument. Can you see the difference now, nowadays in the orchestras? In the past, you could listen 2 minutes and you could say, oh, is the Philharmonie in Berlin. Or this is the French orchestra by style of playing. Do you think it somehow changed already?
Oh,
or?
yes, enormously. Oh. And it has its positive aspects, and it has a lot of negative aspects. And the reason for that has been coming up in the middle of the last century, the radio, and then the recordings. And a typical, I'm talking about the sound, a typical French sound that we still had in the last century's 60s or 70s isn't existing anymore. And it's a very well, the Vienna Philharmonic would tell you, no, we have our whatever. And we are the right people for a Beethoven or a Brahms symphony. And the French, with their style, we are still the people for Debussy and Ravel and whatever. Those things with the recordings and with the radios, where orchestras for the first time, before the radio, an orchestra could never hear itself after or during a performance. Now, with a radio, with a delayed transfer of it, or with a disc, with a recording, the players of the orchestra can hear to what they have produced. So there is a completely, from the existence of these two media, a completely new approach to the music from the performer's side. And that has led, which is absolutely normal, to an assimilation of different sound styles. And let me say it in a very negative way, a globalization of making music. Of course, the level is very high, but it sound-wise, if you, let me say, if you rehearse with the Berlin Philharmonic a Debussy piece for orchestra, they can do that perfectly. And if you now rehearse, I know only French orchestras from Paris, if you now, the Parisian orchestra level is very, very high. If you now rehearse a Schumann or a Brahms symphony with a Parisian orchestra, it could sound like a German orchestra. And with very well rehearsed, a top German orchestra, it could sound like a French orchestra. That didn't exist 60, 70 years ago. That's absolutely for sure. A different approach to sound, especially the woodwinds in France and in Germany and in Vienna, and the horns in Vienna, different. It all has come, I wouldn't say it's all the same. That's not right. But the sound approach, and of course with it, the individual musical approach of the musicians to a piece has come closer together. For instance, you go to Japan, the NHK Symphony is a top Japanese orchestra, all Japanese people. And I remember one of my most satisfying Beethoven Eroica symphonies I've done with the NHK in Tokyo, and not in Germany.
Maestro, we have a great conductor, we have great orchestra, and to complete this experience, extraordinary music, we need the third instrument, which is the concert hall. Do you have any thoughts about the different concert halls and the question where, in your opinion, is the best concert hall now? As I'm asking because we start to build our concert hall, which will be the biggest concert hall in Poland. We started very soon in January, and we have a great project, and we work very seriously with our acousticians. And what is your experience with concert halls? You've been everywhere, maybe Suntory Hall, maybe Berlin Philharmonic.
You're asking internationally,
yes, internationally,
worldwide.
Absolutely. What is your favorite?
There are some favorites, of course. It's Carnegie Hall is an excellent hall. The Boston Symphony Hall, when the hall is full. The Boston Symphony Hall is a huge hall. When it's half empty or so, it's not so good. But when the hall is full, Boston Symphony Hall is fantastic. Of course, Musikverein in Vienna, but also now very good in Vienna, the Konzerthaus, which was renovated. The Berlin Philharmonic Hall is very good. I think also the Gewandhaus in Leipzig is very good. Talking about German, well, there's of course in Amsterdam, the Concertgebouw is fantastic. One says, I haven't been in the new Philharmonie in Paris yet. One says it's quite good, but not the level of Amsterdam or Berlin or so. I have to say, not to speak for myself, the new hall in Dresden has a fantastic acoustic. It's a wonderful hall and should be an acoustic example. It was just constructed 2 years ago. Should be an acoustic example for other new halls that are in procedure. I have to admit, I'm not a great fan of the Hamburg Elbphilharmonie Hall.
And you are not the only one to be
well,
a big fan
it's
of
my
this
personal opinion. The orchestras playing there have to get along with it, but it has no comparison to the Berlin Philharmonic Hall, and there's no comparison even to that Dresden Philharmonic Hall.
Then we have the conductor, orchestra, we have great hall, and we have the audience. What was for the last months extremely difficult, even not possible, to play with the audience. Did you have an experience to play only for the cameras and microphones, no audience? Do you have such experience?
Oh, yeah. Well, we had that all over the world. And it's you enter a hall and you have, well, in the worst periods of this virus, you have in the whole hall, you have sitting there 20 people somewhere around or so, and you have the mics or some TV machines being focused on you. It's I wouldn't say it's an unpleasant feeling. That's exaggerated, but it's not nice. It's not nice. And also, when you have this, we have this at the moment, more or less in Germany. This system of 2 seats occupied, 2 seats empty, 2 seats occupied, the row behind, and so it's the audience that are there try to build up a certain atmosphere, but nothing can compare with a sold-out hall. I mean, that's absolutely for sure. And it has nothing to do with acoustic. It's the encouraging visual impression for the performers to give their best to these people.
Yes, that's all difficult times. We hope it will end soon and we will
Let's
have
hope so, yes.
100% audience again. And after all these years being legendary conductor, I would say, really, what I feel, and this is my emotion, maestro, to you. What is the repertoire? I heard about Wagner, I heard about Bruckner. Do you think still if you, let's say if somebody will say your last tour, and you will say what kind of the repertoire you would like to conduct? What is the closest to your heart?
I think the most important person for kicking off, starting the symphonic development over the centuries. The big central point, of course, has been Beethoven, but the starter of all of this was Haydn. And I've become, throughout all my years as a conductor, an indefinite admirer of Haydn symphonies, not only the last 10 or so, others before, the humor in it, the construction skills in his writing. It's absolutely fantastic. And the danger in performing Haydn is for a conductor, everybody, even somebody who is a completely amateur in listening to music, can distinguish if a performance of a Haydn symphony, not only concerning precision and all that, but concerning the musical gesture, is right or wrong. So you are, as an interpreter of Haydn symphonies, especially the woodwinds and the first violins and the conductor, you are in front of the audience naked. You do it right or not, and everybody remarks it. There is nothing to hide behind Haydn. And that, for me, is of an immense importance. And it's the Haydn symphonic work cleans our nowadays musical minds. It's a mind cleaner. And this composer is, well, I wouldn't say underrated, that wouldn't be right, but he deserves the same importance than the biggest that we are talking about.
It's very interesting that I will be only the most happy person to ask you in the future to come and to conduct Haydn symphonies. I didn't know that you are such an admirer of Haydn symphonies. Yes, you said it. Very interesting for me because I can see the Haydn, which, if you look at the score, is not the most complicated for the musicians.
No.
But how to put it in a really proper way,
in the
clear
proper
way,
and finding the musical gestures in his tunes lining. And that is, he's a very, very great and important figure of musical history.
Maestro, what about the Polish conductors from the old school?
I've never met this person, but I had a great respect, and I saw him once or twice conducting the Südwestfunk Symphony Orchestra, Witold Rowicki.
Ah, yes.
Extraordinary conductor.
Fantastic.
I really have to say. Yeah.
And Maestro, maybe a strange question, but after being conductor so long, and conducting all the best orchestras on earth and playing in the best concert halls, do you feel sometimes be a bit nervous before going on stage? Or this Brahms and Beethoven you conducted so many times that you are not nervous, but maybe interested what will come out.
Many years ago, a quite well-known intendant of the Berlin Philharmonic told me, who had worked with the late years of Furtwängler, with the Berlin Philharmonic together, and then of course with Karajan. And he told me that Furtwängler, even in his last years, before entering the scene, before starting a concert, walked around nervous and over tense and nearly hysterically concentrated on what was going on stage after a couple of seconds. And he told me Karajan was talking with him before entering on scene about the most profane things, and this and that and that and that. And the moment he entered the scene, he switched completely and was in this atmosphere of being nervous or being tense or being expecting something. Concerning myself, by no way any comparison to these enormous, gigantic names. Pieces that I've conducted very often and that I've conducted with plenty of different orchestras, where I have the solid feeling I know them deeply, very well. But knowing this security, knowing at the same time also that it's always a challenge to be at the expectation of the composer and the composition, makes me not half an hour before a concert or 15 minutes before a concert, but 2 or 3 minutes before I enter, makes me, it's not nervous, but makes me completely focused on that, what will start in 120 seconds or so. Nervous. I was when I was a student and I played the violin not badly. I have to say that in all modesty. I was always a little bit nervous when I played for these commissions to get my stipendium or so. So I know what the real nervous feeling means. I never had conducting. A certain tenseness sometimes, or when you do for the first time in your life after having well rehearsed it, the Sacre de Printemps, for memory, and not making a mistake. You know, if you do there a mistake, it's all over. That produced, of course, I wouldn't do that anymore in my old days, but I've done that when I was music director in Dortmund. I've done all these things for the first time, and also Sacre, and I was absolutely keen on doing it without the score, and I managed to do it. But I was very not nervous, but very tense on it, but really nervous like this or so in conducting, no.
But still the emotion during the concert, how you...
Oh, yeah. You have well-prepared things, and during the rehearsals, precisely have tried to get those things musically under control. But in the evening, you have to let go a little bit. Not too much, of course, but give the impression to the musicians they do it.
But as we will play the Fourth Symphony by Brahms tomorrow evening, do you think your understanding of this music has changed during the years? For example, you're conducting half a century ago.
Yeah, I've often thought about these things, but of course it might have been. But concerning my brains, I think I give very little importance to that aspect of music making. I think it's natural that you, well, many people say when a conductor gets older, he gets slower. There is also the opposite tendency of trying to pull things more together and moving more forward. I think I'm basically more belonging to this group of conductors, but there is, in a certain unconscious way, a development in handling the same piece over the years in different manners. And also, of course, you have to remain on Brahms number 4. You have to take into the consideration in the finale, the variation, the Passacaglia, the first flute player's capacity to play his variation musically. If the guy is unmusical, you have to work with him on this and tell him this, unmusical, not unmusical, but not very inventive. You have to tell him this and this and this and this. If you see the guy himself has a certain approach to that, you let him play, of course, his version of it. And that depends, of course, it depends on what you have as artistic capacity in front of you with an orchestra. And that is always different, of course.
Maestro, it's so interesting. Thank you so much. It is a greatest honor for me to listen and to be with you, Maestro. And I hope that tomorrow night concert will be nice for you, an interesting experience with Sinfonia Varsovia, the Polish orchestra. I know you have some special emotions to our country because your family history. Thank you so much for being with us, and I really hope you could accept our next invitation. Whatever you want to play with us, Maestro, even Haydn or Stravinsky.
We'll see.
We'll see, Maestro.
First of all, we have to remain in good health.
Yes.
That's the most important thing. Thank you very much.
Maestro, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję.